The moment the man in the Navy HOA windbreaker pointed at my locked gate and said, "By community authority, we're coming onto this property whether you like it or not," I knew he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The morning air smelled like fresh-cut cedar from the fence I had rebuilt with my own hands, and the slow crunch of gravel beneath 3 white SUVs echoed across the valley long before their engines went quiet. I stood on my side of the steel gate with a coffee mug still warm in my hand, watching 4 HOA officers straighten their clipboards as if they were about to inspect a neighborhood park instead of a piece of private property that had belonged to my family for nearly 50 years. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 39 years old, and I don't lose sleep over loud neighbors, barking dogs, or petty HOA letters because none of those rules have ever applied to my land. That simple fact was about to turn an ordinary Tuesday into the kind of legal disaster nobody in that subdivision would ever forget. Behind the officers, nearly a dozen curious neighbors gathered along the sidewalk, whispering to each other while pretending not to stare. Some held coffee cups, others walked their dogs a little slower than usual, all expecting another homeowner to surrender after being confronted by the HOA. They had no idea they were standing in front of the only property for half a mile that had never been part of their association. The woman leading the group introduced herself without even offering a greeting. Linda Harrison, HOA president. Perfect hair, pressed blazer, polished smile, and the kind of confidence that only comes from believing nobody will ever challenge your authority. She slid a folder from beneath her arm and announced that my property had been selected for an emergency compliance inspection due to multiple community violations. I looked past her toward the entrance monument of Willow Creek Estates sitting a few hundred feet away, then back at the boundary marker resting beside my mailbox exactly where a licensed surveyor had placed it years ago. I smiled because I already knew something she didn't. "Open the gate, Mr. Walker," she said. "No," I answered calmly. She blinked, almost offended by how simple my response was. "Excuse me, this property isn't in your HOA." Silence settled over the driveway, so quickly I could hear wind brushing through the oak trees behind my house. One officer laughed under his breath as if I'd just made the weakest excuse imaginable. Another flipped through paperwork searching for my address. Linda's smile became tighter. "Every property inside Willow Creek Estates falls under our governing documents." I slowly raised my coffee, took another sip, and looked directly at the large metal sign attached to my gate. "Private property. No trespassing. Not part of any HOA." She followed my eyes, frowned at the sign, then looked back at me with the kind of expression people wear when reality refuses to cooperate with the story they've already decided is true. What none of them realized was that this gate wasn't keeping them out because I was stubborn. It was keeping them out because the law had been doing exactly that long before any of their houses had ever been built. Linda glanced back at the growing crowd as if expecting someone to correct me, but nobody said a word. They simply waited for the next move while the breeze carried the smell of freshly cut grass across the road, and a distant lawn mower hummed somewhere deeper inside the subdivision. I rested my hand on the cold steel frame of the gate and found myself thinking about my grandfather, Charles Walker, the man who bought these 23 acres in 1978 when this entire valley was nothing more than rolling pasture, scattered oak trees, and a narrow gravel road that disappeared into the hills. Back then there were no matching mailboxes, no decorative stone entrances, and certainly no homeowners association telling people what color their front doors should be. My grandfather was a surveyor who believed every inch of property deserved to be measured correctly because, as he often reminded me, people forget conversations, but paper remembers everything. My father inherited the land, built the house with his own hands, and spent every Saturday teaching me how to repair fences, clear drainage, ditches, and respect boundary markers the same way other families taught baseball. I still remember the metallic sound of his hammer driving survey stakes into the ground while cicadas buzzed through the summer heat. Those markers were never decorations. They were promises. After my parents retired to Florida 5 years ago, I purchased the property from them through a family trust, not because I wanted a ranch, but because I wanted to preserve the only place that had ever truly felt like home. Around the same time, developers bought hundreds of acres surrounding us and transformed open fields into Willow Creek Estates. New streets appeared almost overnight. Sidewalks replaced cattle paths. Construction equipment rumbled from sunrise until dusk, filling the air with diesel fumes and fresh asphalt. One by one, identical houses spread across the valley until my home looked like an island surrounded by neat rows of roofs and perfectly trimmed lawns. Friends kept asking why I never sold. The offers were generous, sometimes almost tempting, but money could never replace family history. Besides, my grandfather had anticipated something like this decades earlier. He had negotiated permanent private road access, utility easements, and independent parcel status before the first developer ever looked at this valley. At the time, everyone thought he was overly cautious. Years later, his paperwork became priceless. During construction, I watched subdivision signs go up, community pools appear, and security gates installed for everyone except me. Occasionally, contractors asked whether they could connect my driveway to their internal streets to make traffic flow easier. I politely declined every request. Then the welcome letters started arriving. Invitations to neighborhood events. Notices about architectural guidelines. Ballots for HOA elections. Every envelope found its way back to the sender unopened because none of them applied to my address. Eventually, they stopped coming. At least I thought they had. Apparently, somewhere along the way, new leadership convinced themselves that if enough homes surrounded mine, reality could simply be redrawn. Standing there behind my gate, while Linda confidently held her inspection folder, I realized she had probably inherited that mistaken assumption instead of questioning it. She believed geography automatically created authority. My grandfather had spent a lifetime making certain it never would. Linda slowly closed the folder beneath her arm and gave me the kind of practiced smile that probably worked on people who had never questioned her before. The officer beside her stepped closer to the gate, clipboard tucked against his chest, and spoke in the calm voice of someone convinced the outcome had already been decided. He explained that they had received multiple reports of covenant violations involving an unauthorized storage shed, unapproved fencing, and landscaping that failed to meet community standards. I almost laughed. Every item he listed had existed years before the subdivision itself. The cedar fence had been standing since my father rebuilt it after a windstorm. The equipment barn had been permitted when gasoline still cost less than $2 a gallon. Even the gravel driveway they criticized was older than every paved street surrounding it. The smell of sun warming the cedar boards mixed with the faint scent of motor oil drifting from my workshop as I listened without interrupting. I had learned long ago that people reveal much more when nobody rushes to correct them. Linda eventually reached into her folder and removed several printed photographs. They showed my mailbox, my gate, my tractor parked beside the barn, and even the old windmill near the back pasture. Somebody had been walking around outside my property collecting evidence for weeks. She spread the photographs across the hood of one of the sport utility vehicles as though presenting exhibits in a courtroom. According to her, the board had voted unanimously to schedule an immediate inspection because my property allegedly reduced neighborhood appearance standards and created potential liability for the association. I asked a simple question. When exactly did your board vote to govern land you do not own? She ignored it completely. Instead, she informed me that refusing access could result in escalating fines, legal action, suspended community privileges, and possible involvement from county officials. The irony almost made me smile. I had never used their clubhouse, their pool, their walking trails, or even their front entrance. My driveway connected directly to the county road through an easement that had existed decades before Willow Creek Estates became more than lines on a developer's blueprint. The officer holding the clipboard flipped to another page and pointed toward a satellite image with a yellow outline drawn around several properties. My parcel had been colored inside the same border as every house in the subdivision. That was their entire argument. The map looked official enough that most homeowners probably would have accepted it without question. I recognized the image immediately. It came from a public website that displayed approximate parcel boundaries and even carried a disclaimer stating it should never be used for legal purposes. Someone had printed the picture, highlighted it with a marker, and turned it into HOA evidence. A few neighbors leaned forward trying to see what was on the page, quietly nodding as though the colored outline settled everything. Linda noticed their reactions and became even more confident. She announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear that nobody could simply decide they were exempt from community rules. I looked beyond her toward the stone entrance sign standing beside perfectly trimmed flower beds and thought about how easily appearances convince people they understand ownership. They saw one neighborhood. I saw decades of recorded deeds, surveys, easements, and legal descriptions resting inside a fireproof cabinet less than 50 feet behind me. They believed they had arrived prepared. They had no idea they had built their entire case on a picture that was never meant to prove anything at all. Linda gathered her papers with deliberate patience, almost as though she wanted the silence to work in her favor. Then she reached into another folder and produced a bright yellow notice sealed inside a clear plastic sleeve. She held it high enough for the neighbors to see before carefully taping it to the outside of my gate. The adhesive crackled in the warm sunlight, while a few people whispered to each other across the street. According to the document, I had 10 business days to correct multiple violations or face daily financial penalties established by the association. I read every line without saying a word, not because I agreed with any of it, but because details matter. The paper cited sections from governing documents I had never signed, referenced architectural standards that had never applied to my parcel, and demanded compliance with a board that possessed no legal authority over my property. Even so, Linda looked completely satisfied as she stepped back to admire the notice hanging on my gate like some kind of public warning. She believed appearances created legitimacy. I believed records did. Before leaving, she informed me that the board would return with additional representatives if I continued refusing access. One of the officers quietly photographed the notice after attaching it, making certain they documented what they considered proper service. Their engines started one after another, filling the air with the low rumble of idling sport utility vehicles before the convoy slowly disappeared toward the subdivision entrance. The crowd scattered just as quickly. A few neighbors offered sympathetic smiles while others avoided making eye contact altogether. By late afternoon, my mailbox held 3 handwritten notes. One warned me that fighting the association was expensive. Another suggested I simply cooperate because everyone eventually gave in. The third came from an older resident named Harold Benson, who had lived in Willow Creek Estates since the first homes were completed. He wrote only one sentence. They have never heard the word no before. That evening, the smell of rain drifted across the pasture as dark clouds gathered beyond the tree line. I sat at my kitchen table with the yellow notice beside a stack of county records I already owned, comparing every citation against actual property documents. The more I read, the stranger everything became. Their violation references assumed my parcel had been annexed into the subdivision years earlier, yet every deed in my possession described the land exactly as my grandfather had purchased it decades ago. There was no amendment, no recorded transfer, and no signed agreement placing the property under association governance. The following morning, another envelope arrived by certified mail. This one demanded immediate payment of an initial administrative fee and warned that unpaid assessments could eventually become liens. I noticed something interesting before I even finished reading. The mailing label listed my address correctly, but the legal parcel number printed inside belonged to an entirely different lot several streets away. Somewhere between assumptions, copied records, and internal paperwork, someone had blended my home into the subdivision without verifying a single official document. I placed both notices inside a binder, labeled the folder with the date, and slid it onto my bookshelf beside decades of surveys, easement maps, tax receipts, and recorded deeds. Outside, the yellow notice still fluttered against the steel gate every time the wind picked up. I left it exactly where they had placed it because sometimes the best evidence is the evidence your opponent creates with complete confidence. For the next several days, I changed absolutely nothing about my routine, and that seemed to frustrate the association even more than if I had argued with them. Every morning, I unlocked my workshop at 7 o'clock, checked the fence line, fed the chickens behind the barn, and spent a few hours repairing an old utility trailer that had belonged to my father. The yellow violation notice remained taped to my gate exactly where Linda had left it, slowly fading beneath the afternoon sun. I could have removed it in seconds, but leaving it there served a better purpose. Every photograph the association took afterward would include their own notice attached to property they claimed to regulate. By the end of the week, another certified envelope arrived. Then another. The language became increasingly formal with every letter. Administrative penalties had supposedly increased. Additional inspections had allegedly been scheduled. One notice warned that continued noncompliance might require legal remedies. I carefully opened each envelope with the same brass letter opener my grandfather had kept on his desk for decades, slipped every document into protective sleeves, and arranged them chronologically inside the growing binder. Paper leaves a trail, and I wanted every step of theirs preserved exactly as they created it. The situation attracted more attention throughout the neighborhood than I ever expected. Drivers slowed whenever they passed my gate. Dog walkers paused just long enough to glance toward the yellow notice before continuing down the sidewalk. A few residents even waved politely, perhaps curious whether I was really fighting the association or simply delaying the inevitable. Late one afternoon, Harold Benson stopped near my mailbox while walking his golden retriever. He lowered his voice before speaking, almost as though the trees themselves might report back to the board. He explained that several homeowners had questioned why the association was spending so much time pursuing someone who did not even use neighborhood amenities, but every meeting ended the same way. Linda insisted that allowing one property to ignore community standards would undermine the authority of the entire board. Authority. That word stayed with me long after Harold walked away. People often confuse authority with ownership, and they are not the same thing. Authority can only exist where the law allows it. Ownership begins with recorded facts, not confident speeches. The following Monday, a white pickup truck bearing the logo of a private surveying company pulled into the subdivision entrance before stopping outside my gate. Two men climbed out carrying tripods and measuring equipment, but something immediately caught my attention. They never crossed the fence. Instead, they stood along the public road pointing toward my pasture while comparing printed maps. After about 20 minutes, they packed everything back into the truck and left without saying a single word. That evening, I searched the county permit database out of curiosity. No survey request had been filed for my parcel. If the association had hired someone, they had done so without requesting. Official county records first. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every decision seemed based on assumptions copied from previous assumptions until nobody remembered checking the original source. I walked into my office, unlocked the fireproof cabinet my grandfather had purchased years before I was born, and carefully lifted out a long cardboard tube sealed with faded tape. Inside rested documents that had not seen daylight in years, including oversized survey plats, original easement drawings, and handwritten notes from county meetings dating back decades. I spread them across the dining room table, and before I had even finished unrolling the largest map, one missing detail immediately caught my eye. It was so small that almost anyone would have overlooked it, yet it explained why every conclusion the association had reached was built on a foundation that had never legally existed. The oversized survey plat covered nearly my entire dining room table, its edges curling from decades inside the storage tube, while the faint smell of old paper and drafting ink filled the room. My grandfather had marked several locations in neat pencil handwriting that remained perfectly readable after all these years. Most people would have ignored the tiny notes scribbled in the margins, but I knew better. He never wrote anything without a reason. One notation beside the northern property line immediately caught my attention. It referenced County Resolution 84-112 and included a single sentence that changed everything. Parcel 17 excluded from future subdivision annexation unless executed by separate recorded instrument signed by owner. I read it 3 times before opening my laptop and logging into the county recorder's public database. Within minutes, I located the original resolution, followed by every amendment filed over the next 4 decades. Willow Creek Estates appeared exactly where I expected. Its declaration, supplemental declarations, expansion phases, roadway dedications, drainage easements, and utility agreements had all been recorded in meticulous order. One document after another expanded the subdivision across neighboring parcels until the community completely surrounded my land. Yet the one document that would have legally added my property simply did not exist. There was no annexation agreement, no signed consent, no recorded amendment bearing my grandfather's signature, my father's signature, or mine. Instead, every expansion carefully traced around parcel 17 before continuing beyond it, almost like water flowing around a stone in the middle of a creek. I compared those records with the colorful satellite image Linda had proudly displayed at my gate. Someone inside the association had apparently assumed that because every surrounding parcel eventually joined the community, mine must have joined as well. That assumption had gradually transformed into accepted fact without anyone verifying the recorded chain of title. I leaned back in my chair, listening to rain tap softly against the windows, and finally understood why their paperwork contained the wrong parcel number. They had never started with official land records. They had started with a neighborhood map, then worked backward until every document matched the story they already believed. The following morning, I visited the county records office carrying copies instead of originals. The clerk, a woman who had worked there for more than 20 years, patiently reviewed each document before smiling with quiet recognition. She remembered processing one of the later subdivision expansions years earlier and immediately located the archived plat books. Together, we compared every recorded boundary. Her finger stopped exactly where my grandfather's handwritten note had directed me the night before. She looked up and said, "Your parcel was intentionally excluded. If someone wanted to place it under the homeowners association, there would have to be a separate recorded annexation document signed by the owner. I do not see one." She printed certified copies of the relevant records, stamped each page with the county seal, and handed them across the counter. They felt surprisingly heavy despite being only paper. On my way home, I made one final appointment with a licensed surveyor who specialized in boundary verification. I did not ask him to change anything because nothing needed changing. I simply wanted an independent professional to confirm what the county records had already established. As I drove back through Willow Creek Estates, I passed the community entrance where a decorative banner welcomed residents home. A few hundred yards later, I turned onto my private drive, crossed the boundary my grandfather had protected decades earlier, and realized the association had unknowingly spent weeks building a case against a property that the public record had never placed under its authority for even a single day. The licensed surveyor arrived exactly when he promised, pulling a white pickup truck into my driveway just after 8 o'clock on a cool Thursday morning. His equipment cases were neatly organized. His county license number was displayed on the side of the truck, and unlike the men I had watched from the road a few days earlier, he began by asking one simple question. "Do you have the recorded plat and deed?" That single sentence told me everything I needed to know about the difference between assumptions and professional standards. We spent most of the morning walking the property line together, stopping at iron pins that had remained undisturbed for decades. Every measurement matched the original survey within acceptable tolerance. Every monument appeared exactly where my grandfather's drawings indicated it should be. The surveyor occasionally nodded to himself before entering another notation into his field book. Around noon, he folded the tripod, looked across the fence toward Willow Creek Estates, and quietly said, "Your boundaries are exactly where the county says they are. There is nothing unusual here except the fact that your parcel is completely independent." That confirmation was all I needed. I thanked him, requested a sealed survey report, and resisted every temptation to send copies directly to the association. Instead, I organized everything inside a new binder. Certified county records went into one section. The original plat and deed followed behind them. The surveyor's preliminary findings came next, along with photographs of every boundary marker and copies of every notice the association had mailed to me. I even included pictures of the yellow violation notice still attached to my gate exactly where Linda had placed it. Every page told the same story without emotion or opinion. Facts have a remarkable way of speaking for themselves when arranged in the proper order. Over the next several days, I noticed more vehicles slowing near my driveway. Some neighbors glanced toward the notice before continuing home. Others simply watched from a distance whenever I worked outside. I remained polite to everyone and discussed the situation with no one except the professionals directly involved. That restraint became part of the strategy. The association expected resistance, arguments, and angry letters. Instead, they received silence. Silence often encourages confident people to keep talking, and confident people eventually reveal how little they actually know. Sure enough, another certified letter arrived the following Monday announcing that the board intended to conduct what they described as a final compliance inspection the next week. The notice stated that representatives would appear at my property to document continuing violations before pursuing additional legal remedies. They even listed the date and approximate time of their visit. I smiled as I read it because, For the first time since this entire situation began, our schedules finally aligned. They believed they were preparing for an inspection. I was preparing for verification. I contacted the county records office and confirmed that certified copies of the relevant documents would be available if needed. I asked the surveyor whether his finalized report would be ready before the announced inspection date. He assured me it would. I checked the cameras mounted near my driveway to make certain they were functioning normally and synchronized their timestamps. Then I placed the completed binder on my desk beside the fireproof cabinet where my grandfather had stored the originals for so many years. As I closed the cabinet door, I realized the entire dispute had quietly shifted. It was no longer about fences, landscaping, or neighborhood rules. It had become a simple question with a documented answer. The only thing left was allowing everyone involved to see that answer at the exact same moment. The morning of the scheduled inspection arrived with clear skies, cool air, and the steady sound of birds echoing through the oak trees that had stood on this property longer than anyone living in Willow Creek Estates. I opened the gate just enough to retrieve the newspaper before locking it again, then carried my binder onto the front porch where it rested beside two sealed envelopes. One contained the certified survey report completed by the licensed surveyor. The other held certified copies from the county recorder confirming every recorded boundary, every easement, and every subdivision filing associated with my parcel. At precisely 9 o'clock, 3 familiar sport utility vehicles rolled to a stop outside my gate. Linda stepped out first, followed by the same officers carrying clipboards and cameras. This time, they were not alone. A county mapping specialist arrived in a separate vehicle a few moments later, followed shortly afterward by the surveyor I had hired. I had invited both professionals simply to answer factual questions if they arose. Linda looked briefly surprised to see them, but quickly regained her confident expression. She announced that the association was prepared to document my continued refusal to comply with community standards. I calmly asked whether she would first like to verify that the association actually possessed jurisdiction over the property she intended to inspect. She answered without hesitation that the matter had already been settled by the board. I opened the binder and handed her the certified copy of the recorded subdivision declaration. She skimmed the first page before insisting it supported her position. Then I turned directly to the recorded expansion documents and asked her to identify the page where Parcel 17 had been annexed into the association. She searched once, then again. The confidence slowly disappeared from her face. The county mapping specialist quietly accepted the binder and compared the certified records against the county database displayed on a tablet computer. After several minutes, he looked up and spoke in the same calm tone he might have used to read tomorrow's weather forecast. He explained that every subdivision expansion had been properly recorded, but Parcel 17 had remained outside the association from the beginning because no separate annexation instrument had ever been recorded. The licensed surveyor unfolded his finished boundary map beside the hood of his truck. Every monument matched the county records exactly. Every property line confirmed the same conclusion. My parcel was completely independent. One of the officers compared the survey with the printed satellite image they had relied upon during their previous visit. The difference was immediately obvious. Their highlighted map had shown approximate graphic boundaries, not legal property lines. The disclaimer printed across the bottom stated that it could not be used for ownership determinations. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Even the neighbors watching from across the street remained unusually quiet. Linda finally lowered the papers she had been holding since the beginning of the meeting. She asked the county specialist whether there might be another document somewhere that had not yet appeared in the system. He answered politely that if such a document existed, it would be recorded, indexed, and available for review, but no such instrument had ever been filed. The entire foundation of the association's claim disappeared with that single statement. The yellow notice still hanging on my gate suddenly looked less like an official warning and more like a reminder that confidence without verified facts can lead even well-organized people directly to the wrong conclusion. The county specialist thanked everyone for their time, collected his records, and drove away without drama because, from his perspective, the matter had never been complicated. The documents simply said what they had always said. The licensed surveyor rolled up the final boundary map, shook my hand, and wished me a good afternoon before leaving as well. that left only the association representatives standing quietly outside a gate they now understood they had no authority to cross. Linda looked at the yellow violation notice still attached to the steel frame, walked toward it without saying a word, and carefully peeled it away. The tape resisted for a moment before releasing with a soft tearing sound that seemed much louder than it should have in the sudden silence. She folded the notice in half, placed it inside her folder, and apologized for the confusion. It was a professional apology rather than a personal one, but it acknowledged the only thing that truly mattered. The association had been mistaken. Within 2 weeks, I received a formal letter from the board stating that every notice, assessment, and proposed penalty previously issued to my address had been withdrawn because my parcel was not subject to the governing documents of Willow Creek Estates. Another paragraph confirmed that my address had been removed from every internal compliance list and that future inspections would not be scheduled. I filed the letter beside every other document in the binder, completing a paper trail that began with my grandfather's survey notes decades earlier and ended with a simple admission of error. Life became surprisingly quiet after that. Neighbors who had once slowed their cars to watch the dispute now waved as they drove past. Harold stopped by one evening carrying a homemade apple pie baked by his wife and laughed as he told me the story had become the most discussed topic at recent neighborhood gatherings. According to him, several homeowners had started asking more questions during board meetings instead of automatically assuming every decision was correct. I considered that the most valuable outcome of all. Responsible organizations become stronger when people verify facts instead of relying on assumptions. A few weekends later, I finally removed the faded adhesive residue left behind on my gate and installed a new brushed aluminum sign beneath the original one. The top sign still read private property. The new one carried only 4 simple words. Not part of any homeowners association. It was not meant to embarrass anyone or celebrate a victory. It simply stated a fact supported by every recorded document that had protected this land for nearly half a century. As the evening sun settled behind the oak trees, I walked the same fence line my father and grandfather had walked before me, listening to the wind move through the branches and the distant sounds of children playing somewhere inside the subdivision. Nothing about the property had changed. The fence stood where it had always stood. The boundary markers remained exactly where they had been placed decades earlier. The only thing that had changed was that everyone finally understood where those boundaries truly belonged. My grandfather used to tell me that land does not argue, boast, or raise its voice. It simply waits for someone to read the records carefully enough to understand the truth. Standing there with the last light of the day stretching across the pasture, I realized he had been right all along. Justice never arrived because I shouted louder than anyone else. It arrived because patience, accurate records, and verified facts will always outlast confident assumptions.